Good afternoon. This is Jason Dean coming at you again for another Film Fanatic video. It is Saturday about noon. So I mentioned this in a couple of videos back that I try to mix things up by doing, aside from doing the reviews of films that I really love, I try to mix things up with doing some, I guess, well, kind of what I call specialty videos, where I'll focus on things that are definitely related and part of that whole tree of films, tree of what films mean to me. I feel like these are just branches in that tree. But I try to do these specialty shows where I'll focus, not something directly related to a film. It could be, a particular area of a film or something very close to it. And I've done some shows of where I did a big show on Stanley Kubrick, my favorite director of all time. Obviously, that's directly film related. And I also did a show about more or less just talking about my own kind of thing of how I kind of run my own way of operating. But then it's also or was also based on conversations I've had with friends and people I've met over the years who are also in the arts to in various degrees about what they find inspiring. I did a show just about that. I did a show of where I did a show on just film soundtracks, my favorite film scores. That was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed doing that one. I also did a show of where I talked about just my band Quantum. That was just about that kind of thing. I also did a show on, the the effects that social media plays, or the effects that I feel that social media have, how they affect new releases, new movies that come out, for good or bad. So I try to mix things up. The main focus always being on the exploitation movies, but I try to mix things up. I have lots of different tastes. So today's going to be a music show. Today is going to be about my history and my deep connection to what is known as black metal. I have a long, 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 long history, as far as I can remember, to this much beloved genre of mine. Long, long history. And it's something I feel is tied to all of those things that I mentioned. The It's tied to film, it's tied to my kind of personal everyday philosophy, it's tied to the music that I write, it's tied to the movies I love, just everything that, makes up my own weird way of how I kind of operate. So I figured I'd do a show. I've always talked about black metal and certain things around it here and there. So I decided to just do a show of that's what I'm going to talk about. So, yeah, I mean, going back in time when I was a kid, you know, I I grew up at the tail end. I grew up in New York, Rockland County, New York, and I lived in a small little town. I grew up in a small little town that was about 45 minutes or so outside of New York City. And my first exposure to music and bands that I remember hearing that were, quote unquote, like heavy metal music, other than hearing music occasionally as a kid on the radio. And my dad at the time was very much into records, and he would play records, and he would have, you know, groups like Robert Palmer and Isaac Hayes, various other things. He had a pretty varied taste in music. So I got exposed to some interesting music at that time. But I remember, the first time I ever heard Ozzy Osbourne, who was also my first concert that I saw, first live experience of seeing a band. That was like probably, I remember it was Ozzy Osbourne Blizzard of Oz was like the first, album that I ever heard that was metal, heavy metal music. And then from there, I also was, exposed to Kiss. I got really into Kiss. I got really into groups like AC/DC. I got into, you know, Black Sabbath, obviously, Led Zeppelin. And I remember the first time that I got exposed to like music that was even more aggressive and music that was a little bit darker was Master of Puppets from Metallica. That was probably my first exposure, or my first album of where I heard extreme music, heavy music that was heavy metal based, but it took the aggression of that music, like Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath. It took that aggression of that music, and it was much more aggressive. It was elevated. It was more intense. It was a little darker. The tempos, the songs were faster. And I remember Master of Puppets was my gateway album to what would be extreme music, extreme metal music. And then from there, I really got into thrash metal music. Thrash metal music was music that, well, like Metallica, but there was a whole bunch of other bands that came out of San Francisco, particularly like the San Francisco area in California. There was this whole scene called the Bay Area thrash, and there was a bazillion bands that came out of that scene, and I got really into a lot of the thrash metal bands at the time. It was Metallica, bands like Exodus, Flotsam Jetsam. There were bands like Forbidden was another band, and for a while I was like listening to, and at that time I got exposed to Metallica. That was the first band, and I became a huge Metallica fan. I started buying all of their albums, Ride the Lightning and Justice for All, Kill 'Em All. I mean, the list is endless, and I was enamored by that music. And I remember the first time that I heard, and this was over a period of quite a few years, and I was about, when I first got exposed to metal and then thrash metal, and it was a short period of time until I got into Ozzy and Black Sabbath, and was probably within a year or maybe even less when I got exposed to like thrash metal, like a more extreme version of that music, or of this music. It was probably only about 6 months to a year after, so it was pretty quick. And then I was into the thrash metal thing for a while, for maybe a couple of years, and then I came across this band Slayer, and they had just put out Rain and Blood, and I was like, during this time span, I was probably 10 or 11 years old, 12 years old, 13, those years, those real formative years. And I remember the first time that I heard about Slayer, and then the first time I bought Rain and Blood from Slayer, it blew my mind. It was that music, that album at that time, I felt, with compared to the music that I was listening to, was so much more intense. It was so much darker. I was also, at that time, very much being, I was very much into horror movies. That was also the time when, like I've said, during that age, the VHS thing was very much, a main kind of mainstay of like everyday life. That's how people watch movies, and that was how I got exposed to all the great horror movies, all the great horror exploitation movies, and that whole wonderful genre. And I remember when I listened to Rain and Blood from Slayer, it was like, for me, it was those images, those kinds of aesthetics that I was seeing in film. It was that, but put to music, and it was suddenly way heavier, way darker, way more intense than any of the music that I was listening to at that time. And I became a massive Slayer fan. Over the years, I've seen Metallica play. I've seen them play about 3 times. I had seen them play about 3 times. And I also started going to see Slayer. I saw them about 3 or 4 times. Saw them in concert. Just really enamored with them. I also got into bands like Pantera at that time. They were I felt like a band that was taking those, elements of thrash and more extreme music, hardcore, punk music, and playing this really new kind of version of that, which was really aggressive. But Slayer to me was like the darkest thing around, and with their imagery, the lyrical content, it was, and it always there was something about when I first heard that album that there's something about the darkness of that album that kind of always kind of scared me. But it was like that same kind of thrill ride that I got from watching horror movies. The same kind of thing. And it was like a combination. It was like both of those things, put together. The loves that I had, the love that I had for film, horror films, at a young age, and the extreme music. And I saw Slayer, a few times when I was a kid, and I was always just enamored. Went out again, became an obsessive fan, bought all their albums, followed them for many, many years. After that, and and Rain and Blood, when Slayer put that album out, that was the next kind of like gateway album for me. Just kind of how Master of Puppets from Metallica was my first exposure to heavy music or extreme heavy music. But with Slayer, it was even more. It was at an even higher level of intensity, and that album was the album that introduced me and got me into death metal. After that, and at that time in Tampa, Florida, especially, that was kind of the mecca of where all of these even more extreme bands were coming out, and there were bands. The bands that were coming out of that area were bands like Obituary, Morbid Angel, Cannibal Corpse, Malvoyant Creation, Atheist. So many great bands. And when I got exposed to bands like Obituary and especially bands like Morbid Angel, to me it was even this another explosion and even more of this elevated kind of form of musical darkness where the music was even more intense, the lyrical content was even more intense, the aesthetics were even more at a higher level, and it was this next level of extreme music. And and then eventually getting into bands like Napalm Death, and that was also the time when the whole grindcore thing was coming out of Birmingham, England. So I was getting exposed to all of those bands right at that same time. Earache Records was a British label that was putting out a lot of metal bands, Morbid Angel, Napalm Death. But my obsession at that time, when I got exposed to this whole like Tampa, Florida death metal scene, were Obituary had just put out Slowly We Rot. The first Cannibal Corpse album had come out. Altars of Madness had just come out from Morbid Angel, and to me, it was mind blowing because it was such even more of this some kind of link to the horror movies that I loved, and also I was also reading. I started reading the first writer I ever got exposed to, like literary writer who was a horror writer, was Edgar Allan Poe. So all of those things, I felt I was, seeing in movies, all those images, the dark aesthetics, and in the literary books I was reading. I also got into H.P. Lovecraft, and various other writers. That to me, when I was exposed to this even, this really extreme music that was known as death metal, was even more of a combination of all those things that I loved at a young age. So for years and years, and by this point I was kind of in high school. So I became a huge obsessed fan, of extreme heavy music, and devoted to death metal. I also always had an open mind though too. I was also into lots of other things at the time that were not really at all resembling metal. I was into a lot of hip hop and rap. I had talked about in previous videos over the last few months of I had friends that were part of that were DJs. So I was listening to like the early stages of like American techno and also European techno, like UK techno that was coming out, early forms of house music, also hip hop that was coming out, Public Enemy, the Beastie Boys were out at that point, Run DMC, KRS One, Cypress Hill. I was into all of that music as well, big time. I was also really into like Depeche Mode. They were my one of my favorite bands. But for the most part, I was into all of this extreme heavy music. I loved this stuff and I was obsessed with it. And I used to go to all of these metal shows as a kid. I started, that inspired me to, to take up an instrument. First, I played guitar for a few years. And then I eventually got into, started playing drums. We started putting together bands. All of that music, all of the music that I was listening to at the time was purely what was inspiring me to do this crazy thing. And during this whole period, this was obviously many, many years before the internet. So the way kids and the way like my friends and the way I got exposed to music, and a big thing at that time were these things called fanzines. And people would basically, like fans of this extreme music and heavy music, would basically create their own, you know, magazines. They would they would be these like handwritten magazines, and they would make copies of them, and basically, trade them, and then that would lead to correspondence with, like say you might come in contact with like, a couple of other groups of kids that were into the same kind of music, say in like California. And you would have like and this was all through, the fanzine things. You would come across these fanzines, and a lot of these fanzines sometimes would be in local music stores. And you come, you'd walk in the store, you go, and it was all cassettes and records, but it was mainly cassettes. That's what I used to buy as a kid. All my death metal bands that I was into, and thrash metal and all that stuff, was all like were these cassettes I would buy. But a lot of the times it'd be magazines and, newspapers, music magazines that were coming out at the time. A lot of metal magazines, K-Rag, and then you had your American magazines like Rip Magazine, and also like Circus Magazine. I was also very much into, at that time, I was also very much into the hardcore scene. The, bands like DRI, Minor Threat, and Cryptic Slaughter, and Agnostic Front. I was also into a lot of the punk bands, but the extreme heaviness of this new style of music, death metal, was kind of, to me, it was the most aggressive form of music, and it was darker than anything else. So that was like what I got into, and I eventually got into bands like, other bands I got obsessed with, and bands I still love. Bands like Autopsy. The list is just endless. So, but you'd be in the store buying tapes, searching through the bins, and they would have these little magazines, and they were fanzines, and people would drop them off, and you would you pick them up, and you'd see these like write-ups or little descriptions of like bands that were like kind of underground, or people that were trying to promote their band, or people that were looking to like trade music, and you would get in contact with somebody, another kid like your age, who had the same interest. You both had long hair, you had all the metal t-shirts with like the blood and stuff all over them, and the pentagrams and all of this craziness. And you'd strike up sometimes friendships with people, and you'd have to like write a handwritten letter and send it in the mail, and then wait, for a few weeks or a week to go by, and you get a response, and then you sometimes strike up a pretty good friendship with people. And then you'd get into the tape trading thing. They'd be like, "Hey, have you heard of this band?" And be like, "No," or "This band's really cool." And then you'd start sending tapes through the mail, and it was such a cool time. I remember, I had at one point established some friends that were living. I grew up in New York, and I remember being in contact with a few different people that lived way at the other end of the state, that were also fellow metalheads, and through that we met and corresponded, became friends, and then we would like, find a spot or go go someplace and we would all like meet and hang out and for the first time, and we'd meet in person, and it was like so cool, and we'd just hang out and and just party or whatever. And it was a great time. And I had a friend at the time who I also played music with, this guy Joe Sibley, and he was very much into his whole thing. He was really into the tape trading thing. He was really into the fanzine thing. So he was in correspondence with tons of people all the time, and taping, and tape trading. He uh and he was one of those guys that always got me into new bands. He always was like had his ear to the ground and would always come across these different metal bands that were, in this genre, but they were like way more obscure, not as popular, but some really great bands. So he would always turn me on to all of these bands. And over a couple of years, I remember one day he came over my house, and we would our typical thing that we had our little circle of burnout friends. We all had super long hair and the metal t-shirts, and we were the outcasts of the high school. I was in high school at this point, and mostly everybody hated us, but we had our own little group and we hated them. And our favorite thing to do was to like jam and hang out and play music. And then our other thing that we used to do was we would just you know party our asses off and get drunk and fucked up and hang out in the woods. And we used to bring a little boombox with us with like death metal tapes or whatever, and go hang out in the woods and drink 40-ounce beers to where we couldn't stand up anymore and we'd like collapse. And that was like what we would do as kids. And it was crazy and it was super fun. And that's how we partied. We'd hang out in the woods, get drunk as all hell, get super stoned and listen to death metal and get totally fucked up and barely make it home. Sometimes have to, almost pass out and sleep in the woods and try to hide it from our parents when we would come home. And we would do that every weekend. And it was like, it was an amazing time. I did all that partying by the time I got to college. I wasn't so much a partier when I was actually in college. I did my fair share, but I got most of that out of my system at a very young age, mostly like in high school. But it was a great time. And I remember one day after, we did this for quite a few years, 3 years or so. And I remember one day Joe Sibley had come over. We got together and he's like, hey, I gotta play play this band for you. And he was like, and I was like, who is this band? And he's like, he was saying how he was through the fanzine system and, sending letters back and forth. He got has had he was in touch with a lot of these bands that were in Norway at the time. And I was like, wow, Norway, like that's so far away, like that's like international. And he's like, yeah, there's all these bands coming out of Norway, and I've been in correspondence. And he's like, yeah, and there's this band that I just got a hold of one of their tapes through this guy I met who has a record store in Norway, and this band is called Mayhem. And I was like, what is this? And I remember he played, and we listened to it. We listened to it at my house, and I just could not believe what I was hearing. It was now like this music that I was hearing was even more, I found, even more extreme and darker and just more brooding and foreboding and just more intense than even the death metal music I was listening to. I was like, what is this? And it was the first time I ever heard Mayhem, which was one of the most, kind of one of the landmark bands that started the black metal scene in Norway. And the first band I ever heard was Mayhem, my head was blown off my body. I never heard music like that before. It was so extreme, so dark, and it was a wild story because Joe was actually in correspondence at the time, actually sending letters back and forth to a man who has become infamous and very, very notorious in the whole black metal scene, and that is Euronymous. And Euronymous was one of the singers, the second singer in Mayhem. And at the time, to a degree, I really feel like Euronymous kind of single handedly started the black metal scene. He had this tiny, tiny little record shop. He was like maybe 18. He was, at the time, he was a few years older than us. We were like 16, 15 or 16, and I think he was like 18 or 19, which is a couple of years older than we were. But he had started a record label, and also he had a record shop in Norway, and it was called Deathlike Silence Productions. And he had this little record shop in Norway, and my friend Joe was actually in correspondence with him and had letters with Euronymous, and they were going back and forth for a couple of years, and that's how we got exposed to the whole black metal scene. And this was like in '93. This is going back a long time, and a lot of this whole kind of time period is looked at as like the first wave of black metal. And black metal now is huge. It's, it's changed so much, but it's still going strong. It's probably stronger as a genre than, you know, it's probably bigger now than ever. But at that time, it was, it was literally discovering this new language. It was something so unique. It was so, yeah, like, uniquely uh, European. It was something that was something, just something so far removed from what we I was listening to in the States. It was such a new genre of music. And for a long time, for a couple of years, I'd say about 2 years, Joe corresponded with Euronymous, and that gave rise to all of these bands that we eventually through tape trading got exposed to. I mean, you had bands like, during that time there were bands like Burzum, there was Dark Throne, so many great bands that were coming out of Norway at that time. And then eventually you're getting exposed to bands like, there were, in other parts of the world, like bands like Rotting Christ. And it was this explosion, and it was unbelievable. And then eventually, things got, very controversial on that front, of where Euronymous was, during our correspondence, and I remember at one point I even had a correspondence with him, and we sent some letters back and forth. He and I remember his whole like demeanor, like we never met him, never got to talk with him, but it was all through letters and tape trading. He was always he always came across as a very, hardcore devoted fan, and he was always very cool, very gracious, always willing to share the music, and just very, very, kind of outspoken about his love for the music. And famously, you know, the unfortunate tragedy that happened during that time was he was eventually killed. He was eventually murdered. Varg from Burzum, who was also working with Euronymous at the time, who was also releasing the first albums of Burzum, he they had a really nasty falling out, and it's been very, very well documented of what had happened, which resulted in Euronymous being murdered, and then Varg being thrown into prison for many years after that. And and it was just, when I look back at that whole time of when you know I was a little kid, or in high school, and we were in correspondence with you know this guy who was, I feel, even looking back, I feel like probably the key player in the whole black metal scene. And then the tragedy that happened after that, and it was also during a time of where these black metal bands were also being accused of burning churches to the ground, and some of them were involved with criminal activity. They took things to another extreme. And then at the end of the day, a lot of those things were part of the allure of diving even deeper into this whole scene that became black metal. It was an amazing time, and it was the first time that, as a young kid, that I felt I'm like discovering or I'm at the cusp of this new form of art or new form of music. That went on to become a huge source of inspiration for me, even to this day. It's something I really love. It's something I still listen to. I still listen to a lot of those same bands that I grew up on, and I also, discover have been discovering over the years a lots of new bands that I think are really, really great and fantastic bands like Winterfilleth, who I mentioned in the video. They're a relatively newer band that I really love. And typically with the whole black metal thing, the thing that I always loved about it is really the aesthetics. And to me, again, it's tied to film. I've always felt that their music, that really great black metal, especially the old school stuff, and some of the new stuff. I like bands like Dark Funeral, which is a very new band. They've been around for actually a long time, but I actually really like them. And they do something a little bit different. It's a little bit more contemporary sounding, but they still have that classic sound. But the thing that I loved about black metal was how just atmospheric this music was. I always thought, even when I was first exposed to black metal, how atmospheric this film was, where it had like again, going back and tying it to how it's related to films, tying it together. Black metal for me has always had a very cinematic quality. It always brought, for me, creating these aesthetics that make me think of, places like the woods, or being in a really snowy environment, or the cold snow, the cold ice, or even to a degree a beautiful summer day. It always had this music of where, or it had, for me, it's always, the music's always had this thing of where it's always put me in this place to a degree of serenity, but, or of, like in this serene environment that's involves nature, the ocean, but particularly areas of where there's the deep dark woods or deep dark forest, or during a really heavy duty snowstorm. But it always had this quality of where it had this very cinematic quality, and it always would put me in these places. And it was a different thing than other music that I was listening to. And again, for me, it very much had a cinematic quality. Like, it made me really think even more of the things that I love about horror films, and like the atmosphere. That's one of the things I love. That's probably the biggest thing that I love about horror films, particularly in like horror exploitation movies, is the rawness, but the atmosphere, and where it really is this like heavy feeling of escapism in this like alternate kind of fantasy driven universe with like supernatural elements. And for me, black metal always really put me in that place, and it really was kind of this transcending experience, and it always had this rawness to it. The rawness of the music was always probably another big attraction, or always, or definitely is. But the rawness of it, the kind of the frenzied aggression, and also there's a, a contrast. I've always felt with black metal, there's a contrast between, you know, elements of beauty and elements of horror. And to me, I've always felt that, well, that's really in line with kind of the human experience. So it's always had that deeper kind of primal resonation with me. And again, always kind of tying back to films, always ties back or pulls pulls me into thinking about films, the atmosphere that films create, and the films that I love, and with nature, and the whole the a lot of these bands also would always use they would always have a very heavy theatrical element to their presentation, to their stage show, their stage craft even. The typical thing would be wearing all black, or the corpse paint, the the playing in these creating this atmosphere of where there's very minimalist light. There's only you know just enough to where you'll see these figures kind of playing in this dark space. There's just enough light for those kinds of things, and it just has this otherworldly quality. And so for me, seeing these bands taking that theatrical element and really running with it and really creating this alternate universe, for me, even tied it even more into my love of horror films. And it was an entirely different style. It had, I think it had elements of punk music, had elements of death metal, had elements of other music, other extreme music, but the the riffs, the way things were orchestrated, were very unique. And again, I think that they just had this really almost repetitious quality, but they create this almost meditative, or at least for me, would almost create this like meditative state. So it always, sometimes music for me would be very aggressive and fire me up, but then it would also, I would find it to be incredibly soothing and relaxing and kind of meditative in a strange way. So, that music, that style has always been an integral part of, what I listen to. And, I still love death metal. I still love all forms of heavy music, but and I love all kinds of style, many, many styles of music. But there's something about, when it comes to extreme or heavy music, there's something about black metal that I feel even more drawn to, and I think, and I attribute that to how I described that the atmosphere that music creates, and I feel like it brings me in tune, or brings me closer to elements of nature and darkness and the mysterious or the esoteric, the mystery of the universe. All of those things, it kind of it just puts me in that place. And as far as extreme music goes, no other style does it like that. And so I've always had this deep connection to that music because of that. And it's all attributed to just the atmosphere that music really can create. And especially, the bands, that I got exposed to as a kid that I still love and that are actually still around, which is crazy. But even some of the newer bands like Winterfilla that I mentioned, that have done some incredible things where they're doing new things and innovative things, but they're still steeped and very, very entrenched in this atmosphere. So just amazing. And that music also has, a deep impact on some of the music that I write, even with Quantum. I try to, add lots of different elements to that music. And there are certain songs that I have written over the years, or that we've performed as Quantum, that have a little bit, I like to think, was an influence by my love of black metal, that somehow seep their way through this music, or the music I'm writing, whether it's a vocal thing or some kind of melodic thing, or some kind of aesthetic thing. I feel like that's a big part of it. So it's always been this thing. It's always been a part of me, and it's always had this deep kind of connection. So I just figured today I wanted to kind of talk about that. And what that genre, something that's been a part of my youth ever since I can remember to even now, what it kind of means to me, and what that thing is, or what that spark is that I feel kind of resonates with me. So, yeah. So thanks again. This is Jason Dean here at Film Fanatic headquarters. If you like this channel, please like and subscribe. And I appreciate you people checking out the videos, and especially the comments. I love that. Keep that coming. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.